Porsche Cayenne is probably one of the last cars you would expect to have a major history behind it. For many people, it still feels like a modern Porsche, fast, powerful, and too new to be seen as part of the past. But the problem is that development of the Cayenne actually began back in 1997, and its story is far more than another discussion about horsepower, 0 to 60 times, and driving impressions. Cayenne was the car that many Porsche fans hated when it appeared in the early 2000s. Yet in the end, it was also the car that effectively saved the company. Because without it, Porsche's future back in the distant 1990s looked far less certain. But let's start from the beginning. Porsche's golden era came during the 1970s and 1980s, when the company carved out a very narrow but almost cult-like niche and became its ultimate symbol. Porsche built expensive, truly driver-focused cars that, unlike most luxury vehicles of the era, prioritized handling, performance, and driving feel over comfort. At the same time, Porsche managed to achieve something that seemed almost impossible, turning an expensive sports car into something people could actually use every day. Compared to many Italian exotic cars of the time, Porsche was seen not as a temperamental toy for the wealthy, but as a fast, well-built, and surprisingly reliable sports car. Another core part of Porsche's identity became its air-cooled, flat engines. Their sound, vibrations, and character created that unique mechanical feel that millions of enthusiasts around the world fell in love with. But by the early 1990s, things began to change quickly. Porsche sales were falling worldwide, but the situation was especially painful in the United States, the company's most important market. In 1986, Porsche sold around 30,000 cars in America. By 1993, that number had collapsed to roughly 3,700, and the crisis was not accidental. Porsche had relied on the same philosophy for too long. The lineup was gradually aging, the niche remained extremely narrow, and the number of new customers kept shrinking. But the biggest problem was something else. Porsche was no longer the only company building expensive, fast cars for enthusiasts. Mercedes and BMW were moving further into Porsche's territory, offering powerful and prestigious cars that were also noticeably more comfortable and practical. And behind them stood massive corporations with far greater resources and capabilities. The Japanese manufacturers added even more pressure. While Porsche continued to follow its traditional philosophy, Japanese companies were producing increasingly fast, advanced, and reliable cars, around which an entirely new automotive culture began to form during the 1990s. Porsche was not an ordinary company, and nobody in Stuttgart was willing to accept that situation. The key figure became Wendelin Wiedeking, who had joined the company back in the 1980s and became CEO in the early 1990s. Under his leadership, Porsche began a painful but necessary reboot. The first step was a radical reduction in costs. By the early 1990s, Porsche production was still too slow, too expensive, and heavily dependent on manual labor. Wiedeking turned his attention to Japan, since Japanese automakers were considered the undisputed leaders in manufacturing efficiency at the time. But Porsche did far more than simply study foreign methods. The company sent its engineers to Japan to study Toyota's factories, while German plants began working with consultants from Shingijutsu, many of whom had previously helped develop the Toyota production system under Taiichi Ohno. For many people inside the automotive industry, this looked almost humiliating. A legendary German sports car manufacturer with a rich engineering heritage was suddenly learning from Japanese companies that many people still associated with cheap, compact cars. But the results were exactly what Wiedeking had hoped for. Porsche dramatically reduced costs, accelerated production, and transformed itself from a small, niche manufacturer into a modern and highly efficient company. The first major result of the new strategy was the Porsche Boxster. Cheaper and more accessible than the 911, the Boxster attracted a huge number of new customers and helped Porsche sharply increase sales. Many longtime Porsche fans reacted very coldly to these changes, mainly because of the new water-cooled flat engines. As long as the 911 itself remained air-cooled, there was no major controversy. But when Porsche announced that the legendary 911 would also switch to water cooling, many enthusiasts saw it as outright heresy and refused to believe it. Still, Porsche had very little choice. By the late 1990s, air-cooled engines were becoming increasingly difficult to keep compliant with modern emissions and noise regulations. The commercial success of the Boxster and the new 996 generation effectively pulled Porsche out of crisis. Many people consider those models the true saviors of the company during the 1990s. But personally, I believe the most important car in modern Porsche history was the Cayenne. Wiedeking's reforms allowed Porsche to pull itself out of crisis and stabilize the situation. But they did not guarantee the company a secure, long-term future. Porsche still remained a relatively small manufacturer, dependent on the extremely narrow niche of expensive sports cars. And any serious mistake could easily push the company back into crisis. In many ways, Porsche now faced a choice: either continue building nothing but sports cars or try to move beyond its traditional niche. By the late 1980s, the idea of a four-door Porsche was already being discussed inside the company, and the most obvious direction at the time seemed to be a sports sedan. But in the end, Porsche made a far more controversial decision. The company began developing its own SUV. For Porsche fans, who had only recently gone through the transition away from air-cooled engines and the arrival of the more mass-market Boxster, this decision caused genuine outrage. Many accused Porsche of becoming too commercial and abandoning the brand's DNA for money. There were also very real concerns that Porsche's future SUV would end up heavy, clumsy, and completely destroy the image the company had spent decades building. But Porsche management was already looking at the situation very differently. In Stuttgart, they understood that the industry was changing and that the 911 alone might no longer be enough to secure the company's future. Porsche's problem was that the company produced only around 50,000 cars per year. For a project of this scale, the Stuttgart manufacturer simply did not have enough resources or production capacity of its own, even despite its much stronger financial position. The new model was supposed to become the most mass-produced Porsche in the company's history. At the same time, Porsche factories were already struggling to keep up with demand for the new 996 Generation 911. So Porsche began looking for a partner. The company first tried to reach an agreement with Mercedes-Benz, with whom Porsche had already successfully collaborated on the high-performance Mercedes E-Class models of the early 1990s. But the two sides never managed to make a deal. Porsche then turned to its longtime partner, Volkswagen. By the late 1990s, Volkswagen was going through a major rise and had long since stopped being simply a manufacturer of economy cars. The company was simultaneously developing the luxury Phaeton sedan and its own premium SUV. And in the end, Porsche managed to reach an agreement with Volkswagen. That was how Project Colorado was born. Volkswagen was responsible for developing the all-wheel drive system and the shared platform, while Porsche engineers focused on what they did best: suspension tuning and handling. The task in front of them was extremely difficult: to make a 2.5-ton SUV drive like a real Porsche. And doing that with such enormous weight and a high center of gravity was anything but easy. Engineers had to significantly increase body rigidity, develop a fully independent multi-link suspension, and create an air suspension system with adjustable ride height. It is no secret that the Volkswagen Touareg and Porsche Cayenne were closely related vehicles built on the same platform. Because of that, a common stereotype quickly appeared: that the Cayenne was simply a more expensive version of the Touareg. The two SUVs did share a significant amount of engineering, but from the very beginning, both projects were developed in parallel, with each company building its SUV according to its own philosophy. That applied not only to the technical side, but also to the design. The exterior of the Touareg was created internally by Volkswagen, while the Cayenne was designed by Porsche Design Studio. And Porsche's designers did an excellent job. Even though the format was completely new for the brand, the Cayenne still looked unmistakably like a Porsche. The vehicle appeared sporty and dynamic, yet never came across as an awkward SUV wearing a Porsche badge. Most importantly, Porsche managed to maintain a very difficult balance. The Cayenne did not become a niche, half-sports car, nor did it turn into a heavy and overly soft luxury SUV. Compared to many rivals of the early 2000s, The Cayenne felt far more focused, quicker, and more modern. It is hardly surprising that the Cayenne quickly found exactly the audience Porsche had intended from the start: wealthy buyers looking for a fast, prestigious, yet practical everyday vehicle. Its appearance was far from the only advantage. Even the base Cayenne came with a 250 horsepower VR6 engine, while more expensive versions received V8s, producing well over 500 horsepower. Even the diesel Cayenne, introduced near the end of the first generation, offered a respectable 240 horsepower. And while the first generation Touareg could be purchased with a utilitarian diesel engine and a manual transmission, the Cayenne was positioned very differently from the beginning. Even the entry-level Porsche versions focused primarily on performance. As a result, journalists testing the first Cayenne models were impressed not so much by the outright speed, but by the feeling of a large and heavy vehicle accelerating and handling in a way that simply did not match expectations for a big SUV of the early 2000s. The Porsche Cayenne officially debuted in the fall of 2002 at the Paris Motor Show. It was the first Porsche powered by a V8 engine since the Porsche 928 ended production in 1995. The Cayenne also became the first production four-door Porsche and the first SUV in the company's history. Naturally, the press, potential buyers, and especially Porsche fans followed the debut very closely. As expected, many longtime enthusiasts reacted extremely negatively to the new model, and some openly treated it with contempt. But the market reacted very differently. Buyers greeted the Cayenne with enormous enthusiasm. The base Cayenne S started at around $55,000, while the Cayenne Turbo cost nearly $90,000. For the early 2000s, that was very serious money. Yet demand proved so strong that it exceeded even Porsche's own expectations. At that moment, it became clear that Porsche had found an audience far beyond its traditional fanbase. Over time, even some longtime Porsche fans began changing their opinion of the Cayenne, especially once it became obvious that despite its size and body style, the Cayenne drove and felt nothing like most SUVs of the early 2000s. It quickly became clear that this was not simply a Touareg with a Porsche badge. Still, the conflict never fully disappeared. Even today, there are Porsche enthusiasts who believe the Cayenne both saved the company financially and permanently changed its philosophy. And yet the Cayenne can absolutely be considered the most important car in modern Porsche history. Thanks to this model, Porsche dramatically increased its profits, massively strengthened its financial position, and secured a stable future. In the very first financial year after the Cayenne entered production, Porsche's revenue increased by nearly 1 billion euros and continued growing steadily afterward. Between 2002 and 2007, Porsche produced more than 276,000 first-generation Cayenne models. For Porsche in the early 2000s, those were enormous production numbers. And that was only the beginning of the story. The second-generation Cayenne arrived in 2010, followed later by the third generation. And as paradoxical as it may sound, the very SUV that many Porsche fans once considered a betrayal ultimately allowed Porsche to preserve its independence and continue building the sports cars that made the brand famous in the first place. Would Porsche have achieved all of this if the company had chosen to build a four-door sedan instead of an SUV? At this point, that is a question with no answer.